My short for bcm390 is on torture and the treatment of asylum seekers in the Manus Island detention centre. On the 9th of March 2015, the United Nations Special Reporter on Torture, Joan Mendes, presented a report determining that various aspects of Australia's asylum seeker policies violate the Convention Against Torture. The United Nations defines torture as any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted upon a person, and the Convention Against Torture prohibits subjecting people to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment. In his report, Mendes concluded that the Government of Australia, by failing to provide adequate detention conditions, end the practice of detention of children, and put a stop to the escalating violence and tension at the Regional Processing Centre on Manus Island, they have violated the right of asylum seekers, including children, to be free from torture or cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment. This links into my media item, which shows the detainees of Manus Island Detention Centre clinging desperately to the wire fence encaging them, gazing wistfully out at their fading chances of freedom. This is contrasted with a very similar image, only this time the people are just shadows against a blue sky. They are detainees, faceless, nameless, and presented just how the government wants us to see them, out of sight and out of mind. In February 2014, a fatal riot erupted at the Manus Island Detention Centre that left one man dead and scores injured.
Manus Island that was just waiting to happen. Welcome to Four Corners. If there's one thing that the Gillard, Rudd and Abbott governments were all able to agree on, it was the reopening of a detention centre on Papua New Guinea's remote Manus Island to process asylum seekers who tried to come to Australia without appropriate visas. For most Australians, it seems, as boat arrivals in Australian waters dwindled, the woes of detainees on Manus was a classic case of out of sight, out of mind. Until mid-February, that is, when protests by detainees at the Manus Centre sparked the intervention of local guards and Papua New Guinea police, resulting in brutal violence, bloodshed, scores of injuries, and the killing of an Iranian asylum seeker.
The violence outside the centre followed the asylum seekers back inside Oscar compound. This video footage, published by Fairfax Media, shows some of what happened next. Local G4S guards are seen beating asylum seekers back into a building until a foreign guard intervenes.
When they saw the hiding they were getting, the belting that they were getting, some of them thought, actually, this is not what we expected, and tried to climb back over the fence to get back into their compound. They were dragged off the fence and beaten. People from inside the compound saw what was going on and started yelling and screaming, and I was told, but I never saw personally, some of them started throwing rocks at the people who were beating their friends outside, and the PNG guards got upset about that, obviously, and actually went over the fence into the compound and started thumping and belting the transferees inside the compound. And there were significant injuries, and people, they copped an absolute hammering.
As you can see, the actions of the guards during the riot and the treatment of the people involved shows that the detainees are being viewed from the perspective of the bottom image of my media item, not as people, but as shadows, insignificant and unable to fight back against the brutality. Two brave men gave statements about what really happened during the tragic riots, and as a result have allegedly been victims of intimidation and ill treatment. The government did not disclose details of the ongoing legal proceedings to the special reporter, and because of this, Mendes inferred that the Australian government has also failed to comply with its obligation under international customary law to investigate, prosecute, and punish all acts of torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. Academic Tristan Creek is also well versed on the topic of asylum seekers and fully supports the conclusion of the United Nations Special Reporter. He says this policy of mandatory detention has led to terrible human rights abuses and cumulative deterioration in health for those incarcerated, and has become a system of brutality with more in common with torture than respect for human rights. In his article Starving for Freedom, an exploration of Australian government policies, human rights obligations and righting the wrong for those seeking asylum, published in the International Journal of Human Rights, he outlines that while Australia receives very few asylum seekers in a global context, its policy of mandatory immigration detention for those who arrive by boat has unnecessarily led to long-lasting and devastating mental health consequences. According to the Department of Immigration, the number of refugees actually granted protection in Australia reflects only 7% of the 190,000 places available and represents only 0.13% of the 10.5 million refugees in the world. In this context, Australia's contribution and share of responsibility is minute, yet the treatment of our asylum seekers is still subpar. Asylum seekers in Australian-run detention centres are subject to prison-like conditions and exposed to high levels of violence, secrecy and clear disrespect for human rights. One Manus Island detainee from Baghdad was actually a medical practitioner who, over his 2-year stint at Manus Island, coined the term detention syndrome. This clinical condition founded by Dr. Sultan arises as a direct result of the conditions detainees face inside the detention centre. The detention syndrome evolves in stages. Initially, detainees enter into a non-symptomatic stage, where the dismay of detention is mitigated by hope that they will soon have a successful claim. As hope disappears and the prospect of forcible repatriation or indefinite detention becomes more apparent, detainees enter into increasingly more severe depressive stages. The most severe is the tertiary depressive stage, which is characterized by hopelessness, passive acceptance, and an overwhelming fear of being targeted or punished by the managing authorities. Dr. Sultan, having experienced it firsthand, knows that the initial excitement of surviving the journey to Australia, or at least near Australia, is replaced by passive numbness and distrust. This attitudinal change is nurtured by the indefinite incarceration, by the fear of being sent back to a country that persecuted and possibly tortured them, and by harsh and traumatic conditions within detention. Torture comes about by the continued refusal of the government to stop the neglect. Government involvement is systematic because they are the policymakers. They are the ones who choose to sign international treaties and who then have to abide by them. The government has recently passed 2 new laws, the Migration Amendment Bill and the Migration and Maritime Powers Legislation Amendment Bill. Mendes surmises that both bills put Australia at risk of violating the Convention Against Torture. The first because it allows for the arbitrary detention and refugee determination at sea without access to lawyers, and the second which tightens control on the issuance of visas on the basis of character and risk assessments. Daniel Webb, Director of Legal Advocacy at the Human Rights Law Centre, also corroborates the claims of the Special Reporter, expressing that Australia signed up to the Convention Against Torture 30 years ago. We did so because as a nation we agreed that the important minimum standards of treatment it guaranteed. Yet, here we are 30 years on, knowingly breaching those standards and causing serious damage to our reputation. He says, being called out as a nation that breaches the Torture Convention should be a wake-up call for Australia. Rather than pursuing costly, cruel and unlawful policies, Australia should work with the United Nations and regional partners to develop safe pathways to protection for refugees. Australia's disregard for its international responsibilities and obligations has compromised its international reputation and weakens its position to legitimately raise or comment on human rights issues in other countries, in particular, human rights violations of ethnic minorities. This is especially relevant given that Australia is now on the United Nations Security Council. In conclusion, my media item shows the contrasting representations of asylum seekers detained on Manus Island. They are clinging to the fence like animals in a cage, lacking hope, trust and their livelihood. Australia has signed the Convention Against Torture many years ago, and now the government seems to have forgotten about it. The Australian government needs to step up and take this issue seriously, otherwise we may end up with more than just a bad report from the United Nations.